Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5. As you can tell by my voice, I'm still not 100% back from RSV, so still dealing with it, but hopefully I don't have to talk a whole lot tonight because we have a lot of great articles and great discussion leaders. We did have a couple of small changes to our schedule. So I know I warned you last week that this week would be a very long session because we had 8 articles. It turns out we only have 6 for this week, so this week will be a little bit shorter than I thought it would be. But this week focuses on the administrative aspects of intergovernmental relations. Again, just building on the foundation we established earlier with the discussion of the Constitution, the discussion of political aspects, last week fiscal aspects, and now this week administrative aspects. So the 6 articles that we have to discuss tonight, the first one is Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations, and that's Baylin's. Politics of Unfunded Mandates, which is Jason's. Another Look at Bargaining, which is Yesenia's. American Public Administration, which is Michael's. Homeland Security, which is Travis's. And then Intergovernmental Relations article, which is Jesse's. So 6 of them for this evening. Before we get into our discussions of the articles tonight, just a real quick reminder is you have discussion board number 5 that is coming due next week. And for discussion board number 5, you're going to draw upon one of the topics for tonight. And that topic is bargaining and negotiations in intergovernmental relations. And you're going to provide me with an example you're familiar with of intergovernmental bargaining and then discuss that and how that bargaining occurred and the result of that bargaining between different levels of government. And that will then constitute your discussion board number 5. I think that a lot of folks are turning in their article critiques, and so that's very good. Remember, you've got those 2 article critique assignments. I think the vast majority of article critique number 1 have already come in, and critique number 2 are starting to flow in as well. But do remember that you need to have those critiques done and submitted before we discuss the article in class. Next week, what we're looking at for our final week together is on the 24th. We then have, technically, we have 7 articles that are scheduled for next week. We will see how we progress on the 24th. If we get through all those articles on the 24th and do my little wrap up, then we'll be able to forego our Saturday session on the 27th. If not, if we still have some articles to discuss, then we will have our Saturday session on the 27th. And we'll talk next week about the scheduling of that session. I think I had mentioned at the beginning of our course together that I have a little scheduling issue on that Saturday in that I am teaching the first course, the 500 course for the new cohort number 24, on that day. And so we may have to move our session maybe back a couple of hours. But if we get through everything, then we won't have to worry about doing that Saturday session. But we'll see how we progress and we'll see how things go. Okay. Questions?
That was the one I used to tell my mom. The other box is over there.
I do have a question.
Sure.
Tonight, we're not discussing the federalism by waiver article, the Medicaid one.
That's correct. That one is going to be pushed to next week.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, then, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our administrative aspects articles. And we'll start with our first one, which is Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations. And that one belongs to Baylin. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, my throat's a little off too. But let me go ahead and get started. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So let me know if you can see it or not. Can you guys let me know if you guys can see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. So I'm doing Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations. It's an article by the U.S. Advisory Commission of Intergovernmental Relations. And so the article itself kind of talks about the old versus new methods of intergovernmental relations. And I think like a really clear way of explaining it, or how seeing the techniques or approaches that have been used as to what is currently being used is saying that the requirements traditionally attached to assistance programs may be viewed as part of a contractual agreement between two independent co-equal levels of government. So this kind of sets how previously we would see intergovernmental relations between higher and lower levels of government as being two co-equal levels of government. Whereas now, in contrast, we see that the policies that the new intergovernmental regulation imposed on state and local governments are more nearly mandatory. So we kind of see a big shift to where before it was kind of saying like it's like two levels of government who are equal partners are working together and having that relationship. But now instead we see it more as a higher level of government actually imposing more regulations or mandates down to the lower levels. So it's kind of like, saying like the bigger guy is able to impose some of the things that they want happening to the lower guy. So that's a really good method or way of kind of viewing how these relations have shifted over the years. This is a really good quote that I found in the book that said, in one way or another, compliance has been made difficult to avoid. So I think it really kind of sets the tone to the techniques that the techniques that we're going to go ahead and explore a little bit more. So these are the 4 techniques being used by the national government to kind of mandate and or put on to the lower levels of government. We see direct orders, cross-cutting requirements, crossover sanctions, and partial preemption. So with direct orders, they are very clearly kind of what it is. It's direct orders from a higher level of government instructing a lower level of government to take specific actions or implement certain policies. So it's basically just telling it's basically just the higher level of government telling the lower level of government what to do or what they have to comply with in order to be able to be in compliance. So it's a mandate from state or local actions under the threat of criminal or civil penalties. So we do see that it's not just a simple order. It's kind of like it's an order plus if you don't follow it, this is what could happen. So you could face criminal or civil penalties, which obviously a lot of state or local governments do not want to be addressing. Some of the areas that are more highly affected with this are public employment and the environmental protection. An example of this would be the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 that barred job discrimination by state and local governments based on race, color, religion, sex, and their national origin. This is an example where the state imposed this onto state and local governments, and then it kind of just shifted into being pulled into by private employers as well. In regards to direct orders, we do see some constitutional restrictions that do prohibit Congress from regulating directly. An example of this would be like the wage and hour requirements. So those cannot be imposed on local and state governments. It was like a whole thing where the state said that if this was imposed on them directly, that it would essentially threaten their independent existence. So I have a question for everybody in regards to direct orders. How do direct orders from higher levels of government impact our ability to implement policies at the state or local level? So do you guys see that this can hinder local or state governments being able to address issues within their own I guess like people that they're managing? I'm not sure if anybody's ever like seen how a direct order can. I think based on the discussions that I read this week, I saw a lot of people kind of saying where sometimes we see direct orders, but they don't really apply to the audience and or the demographic of certain state and local governments. And so it can be very hard for that agency to be able to manage their demographic properly. So I'm not sure if anybody has had like an opportunity to like have anything to do with that. If not, we're going to go ahead and move over to cross-cutting requirements. So for cross-cutting requirements, we see that they include conditions placed on the use of federal funds that affect multiple policy areas or programs at the state and local level. Hold on, sorry. These apply to all or many federal assistance programs. Some of the policy areas that are affected here we see are in non-discrimination, environmental protection, public employment, assistance management. An example of this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that says that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program receiving public federal financial assistance. Another question for you guys. In regards to cross-cutting requirements, how do you think that cross-cutting requirements have influenced the coordination and alignment of certain programs and policies across different sectors? Do you guys think that these requirements that are being imposed can have like a negative or a positive effect, or how they can basically hinder certain policies?
I think speaking from the public employment perspective, it actually helps us because we're all public employees and we have to go through a competitive process to gain that job. So I think kind of going through that process gives us a fair competitive. So there's no favoritism that, John Smith got the job because he knows a director. It's like, no, we have to go through the public employment policy, and we have to make sure it's a competitive and fair process to all.
That's true. I think that's at the beginning of a lot of the creation of a lot of these things, a lot of these like mandates or acts. It is to benefit in a certain way. And I think it's also important to see the benefits of it. And it really does apply differently to every single agency per its demographic and per its like goal. But the next one would be crossover sanctions. So for crossover sanctions, we can define this as crossover sanctions involve the use of federal authority in one policy area to influence state or local behavior in another unrelated policy. The book says that with the threat of termination or reduction of aid provided under one or more specified programs unless the requirements of another program are satisfied. So some of the areas where we see this at the highway safety and beautification, health planning, and handicapped education. An example of this would be the Highway Beautification Act of 1965. And as I was kind of like reviewing some of this information, it kind of really made me think about John's discussion post and how it kind of says that in order for the money, that federal money to be received, you have to go through all these steps that need to be satisfied in order to actually receive that money. And if one of those steps is not completed, you are threatened with the possibility of no longer receiving that and or having that money taken away or cut in somewhere in the middle. And that does put a big I guess like weight over an agency who is essentially counting on this aid to be able to fulfill certain requirements and or goals to, do whatever that they had intended originally. So having that on them will really make it to where they have to. And sometimes having to fulfill all those requirements can kind of put a hindrance on actually getting to that ultimate goal. So the last one would be partial preemption. This is the last one of the techniques used by the national government, and partial preemption can be defined as occurring when the federal government sets minimum standards of regulations, allowing states to enact more stringent regulations, but not less stringent ones. This is where they establish federal standards, but delegate the administration to states if they adopt standards equivalent to the national ones. And some of the areas that are affected are natural resources, environmental protection. Oh, sorry, meal and poultry inspection. Here, an example of this would be the Water Quality Act of 1965. And previously, I had also used an example of the Clean Air Act. And it's very similar, where we see how the federal government has their own minimum standards of what they, require to qualify under the Clean Air Act, but California as a state has chosen to adopt more stringent regulation that they are putting on the state. And this is something that essentially it's kind of like, how do I say it? It's kind of like saying like, okay, like you can do this, like you can administer this, but this is the very minimum. So it's kind of not really giving all of that like administration power. It's kind of like really saying like you can administer this, but these are some of the regulations or the rules that you still have to follow. So it definitely still sets certain boundaries that are in place, and it in a way makes certain governments feel like they have a little bit more power than honestly they truly do. Um, And I guess here's another question for you guys. Do you guys have any other examples that you guys can think of where the federal government has set their regulations and certain states have decided to pick up on more stringent regulations?
Hi, Bill, and maybe it's not quite the same thing, but I guess I'm going to take it down a level since I work with a local government. And so one thing that came to mind was building codes. So the state has a set of building codes, and the state can, via like an ordinance, establish that they're just going to follow the state building codes. Or they can adopt an ordinance where they have more stringent building codes. And one of the reasons why, at least the city that I work for chose to do just the state building codes was that it is already complicated enough to try to explain what people can and can't do on their properties. But I guess the city felt that by enacting more regulations, it would just overcomplicate an already complicated issue. But I guess there's cities
No,
that do modify them.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And kind of jumping from what you're saying, Aoife, for everybody else, do you guys think that when certain government, like state governments, are deciding to either follow follow certain standards as they are, or deciding to make them actually more stringent and or restrictive, I guess you could say, what do you guys think are some of the reasons that they do that? Kind of going back to the Clean Air Act and the like electric vehicles and all that stuff that we had talked about previously. Obviously we can't really like know to the, to like the root of things, but kind of just brainstorming, I would think that, for example, California, they do want to kind of be that progressive state that wants to, kind of take lead and take charge and setting kind of an example for some of the other states. So in a way, it makes them look good, and it also kind of puts them ahead of the curve as we continue kind of moving forward and being more, environmentally aware. So I'm not sure if you guys have any other thoughts on, why some states do decide to be a little bit more more strict and or adopt more stringent standards for their own states and or local governments.
Hey, Belen, I think with California, one of the issues with going so strict on environmental regulations is it's driving businesses out of the state, and from what I understand, it's getting worse and worse, especially with increased taxes. So in some ways, being progressive isn't always the best thing. And, we used to be one of the highest, I think we still are one of the highest economies, but if we continue on this path where we nitpick every regulation, I mean, we're eventually gonna get rid of everybody there. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely politically motivated rather than what makes business sense. And I'm curious to see how it'll all play out later on.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think everything does have a pro and a pro and a con to it. And we do really have to see as to, are these effective? Are they not effective? And that'll kind of lead me to my next question. But I'm not sure if anybody has anything else to add as to why they think that states are, choosing to be more stringent on certain things than others.
I think it also do a lot with the politics of the corresponding state. I mean,
True,
California,
yeah.
like insinuated, is obviously more left leaning than probably every other state in the country, and they kind of take the lead on, issues such as like COVID or the environmental issues that are taking place or gay marriage, whatever it may be. I mean, they were always like the first or one of the first states to do certain things. And like you said, I think it is because they want to take the lead, because they do think we have an identity, whereas other states may follow suit.
True. Yeah, no, I mean, I see that. And I totally agree. And actually some of those examples that you mentioned definitely kind of show the trend that California seems to be setting for themselves. Like you said, like kind of like saying, oh, we're ahead of the curve. And then kind of picking up on what John said, like, some of that could be positive and or negative based on where you stand, obviously. Um, so this leads to my final question, which is, how effective do you think these techniques are with this like new method of intergovernmental relations? Like, do they actually promote collaboration? Or do you think they're actually more of a, hierarchy level where it's top to down sort of method? What do you guys think? Or maybe I'll make it a little easier, actually. If you guys think that by imposing these these four different techniques in the relationship between higher and lower levels of government, if you think they're effective, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll go ahead and see how many hands we have raised.
Can you repeat the question one more time? Sorry.
Yeah. Do you guys think that by following these four methods or techniques, direct orders, cross-cutting requirements, crossover, and partial preemptions, do you guys think that by having this be a part of the way, sorry, let me make this simpler. By following these four techniques, do you think that it actually promotes effective government or effective relationships between lower and higher levels of government? If you say yes, go ahead and give a hands up. If you say no, I think there's a thumbs down somewhere. I'm not really sure. I see a few hands up, few hands up. Cool. So I think so too. I think that kind of like what John said, and I kind of think it really should leave everything. I think it kind of puts things into perspective where, these were put in place in order to kind of have more of a streamlined and or base to continue building on intergovernmental relations. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that they apply to everything. And I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be a con with the pro. So it's important for us to be able to look at them and be able to analyze them and see, what works per um certain instances. And I think that, since most of us are working in local government, we're gonna be able to see this firsthand as we move forward and see, especially if we're working with agencies that do rely on federal funding. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you, guys.
Okay, very well done. Thank you, Balin. I think all your questions were very appropriate, and this article is very akin to the break article from last week. You know, the break article last week set up for us different types of grants to help us understand our ensuing discussion of fiscal federalism. This article kind of does the same thing for our discussion of administrative aspects of federalism by laying out for us these four different types of mandates. And I think it's a really good question in terms of which of these mandates promote coordination, which may detract from coordination. Whenever we need to try and understand why the national government is using one type of mandate as opposed to another type of mandate, I think what we really need to do is we need to look at the intentions of the national government. What is the national government trying to do, number one? And then number two, what does the Constitution permit the national government to do? So the national government, such as in the 1960s, really wanted to have this top-down approach to decision making and really wanted to just use mandates to try and get the compliance of state and local governments to achieve national objectives. That's when you tend to see things such as direct order types of mandates. That's where you see things such as fully preemptive types of mandates. However, if the national government is really looking more at looking at state and local governments as being partners in accomplishing goals and objectives, then you might see something more like a partial preemptive approach, whereby they will allow state and local governments to come up with their own approaches as long as their approaches are at least as strict as the federal minimum standard, which, as Balin pointed out, we see that in terms of water quality. We see that in terms of a lot of environmental protection type of legislation. So number one, what is the national government trying to accomplish? And then the second question we ask is, well, what does the national government, what does Congress have in terms of constitutional power over this policy or over this issue? When Congress has the constitutional power to tell state and local governments to take certain types of actions, again, that's when we're going to be more likely to see direct order mandates and fully preemptive types of mandates. When the national government does not, and Congress does not have constitutional power over a specific policy or a specific issue, that's when the national government's probably going to use something more along the lines of a crossover sanction, whereby Congress can say, if you don't do what we want you to do in this area, we're going to penalize you by taking federal money away from you in this area. And one of the examples we used in a previous class session was the example of a crossover mandate, such as the blood alcohol content level regulations of the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration said we want all states to have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. Now, the Clinton administration did not have the constitutional ability to order state governments to adopt the 0.08 level. There's nothing in the Constitution that permits that. So therefore, they use these crossover mandates in order to say, if you don't adopt the 0.08 blood alcohol content level, then you're going to lose federal highway transportation dollars. I think oftentimes state and local governments look at those crossover sanctions, those crossover mandates, as being especially insidious. And they don't like them because they're saying, well, Congress doesn't have the constitutional ability to do this, but they're essentially blackmailing us. They're essentially extorting us to get us to do what they want us to do. Where Congress has the constitutional ability to use direct order mandates and to use fully preemptive mandates usually is in terms of the Commerce Clause. And so if Congress can link what they want state and local governments to do directly to the Commerce Clause, directly to interstate commerce, and they can find that nexus between what state and local governments have to do and the Commerce Clause, then they're able to use these stricter direct order and fully preemptive types of mandates. When they don't have that Commerce Clause type of protection, that's when they tend to use things like crossover sanctions, crossover mandates. So it's an interesting typology of the four different mandates. I think will serve us very well as we move through our discussion of our other administrative aspect articles throughout this evening. But again, thank you very much, Malin. Well done. And it sets us up very well then to move into our next article. And our next article, The Politics of Unfunded Mandates by Paul Posner. And that one belongs to Jason. So Jason, I will turn the floor over to you.
Hi. Happy to do it. Belen, you'll be a tough act to follow. So, moving on. I had The Politics of Unfunded Band-Aids by Mr. Paul L. Posner. Interesting read for sure. I am glad this came to me. I was working in the state legislature. We often have unfunded mandates for our local municipalities throughout the state. And I found this topic particularly interesting because of the anywhere between 40 and $70 billion budget deficit that we're in. So, let me get it ready here. So I'll start with what an unfunded mandate is. This will be repetitive, I'm sure, but it's a federal government regulation or issued on state and local levels without financial assistance. These are often controversial because they place a financial burden on the lower levels of government that can seriously impact their ability to achieve their goals. It's in particular incredibly challenging if you have federal unfunded mandates and then state unfunded mandates as well. So in particular, that hurts local municipalities. Unfunded mandates, according to the text, refer to directives from the federal government to state and local governments or other entities without providing the necessary funding to implement these mandates. The lack of financial support can pose significant challenges for the entities tasked with carrying out the mandated programs or policies. Mr. Posner in the text explores the concept of unfunded mandates and their impact on federalism. The lack of financial support can pose significant challenges for these institutions or programs, what have you, tasked with carrying out mandated programs or policies. Posner also delved into the political dynamics surrounding unfunded mandates and their implications for the balance of power between federal and lower levels of government, as Dr. Powell mentioned, a form of extortion. The article also discusses how unfunded mandates constrain the resources of state and local municipalities, leading to tensions in the federal-state relationship. Additionally, Posner examined the historical context of unfunded mandates, the motivations behind their imposition, and the consequences for effective governance and service delivery. He also discussed the potential reforms or policy recommendations to address the challenges. Unfunded mandates are often been contentious part of government operations and have come under greater scrutiny in many recent years. The government, more so state legislatures and the federal government, issuing mandates to local and state municipalities with no funding mechanism or financial assistance puts enormous strain on these entities. This financial strain accumulates because of the unfunded mandates. Accumulate year after year, regardless of budget deficits. They continue to come in, and the political will is there, depending on the initiative at the federal and state level. But also, these individuals think that I don't think they mean any harm by it. The government officials, it's just more so that they really believe they're helping, but it's more so the local municipalities that are stifled by this. Unfunded mandates can be perceived as unfair, and not just because of the imposition they impose. These financial inconveniences on the federal government, state level, and local level are often criticized because of the enforcement burden and financial burden, and the stifled state governments contend with the growing federal influence, burdensome regulation, and they must enforce, and the lack of say in the matter, and the very little flexibility they leave that the federal government leaves often leave those who are impacted with a lot of frustration. Here's my first question: why do you think local municipalities in particular are frustrated by that? By these more and more regulations? No, I completely agree. You guys are all 100% spot on. It's the looming and just because these regulations and the unfunded mandates continue to come regardless of whether or not these local governments are object to it or not. And it doesn't even have to be local municipalities. It could be a sheriff's department. It could be anything. It could be a specific type of agency or the state as a whole or the city as a whole. And that can prove incredibly challenging. Uh-oh. There are evolving models of the policymaking process to our federal system. There are empirical studies of the politics of the mandates in particular, and that does not mean that that we are talking without intellectual type of benchmarks to guide the analyses. There are broad views of policymaking processes and the federalism that provide ideas and models to help explain the politics of the federal mandates and outlook for reform. Dr. Posner, or Mr. Posner rather, really was heavy with the potential reforms. Part of me believes that reform is too little, too late because with the new federalism, it does not promote or really embrace the use of unfunded mandates. There are many that have a bad taste in their mouth as a result of the federal and state level unfunded mandates. Each of the theories aids in defining mandate politics at various times and stages in our recent history, and there's no one model or approach that may exclusively explain the trends at any one time. Rather, ideas from several different models may be necessary to fully capture the outcomes of mandate policymaking. Me working at the state level, I would argue it's the will is there for unfunded mandates with some in the legislature, but Mr. Posner focuses on congressional alignments in the federal mandates. What do you guys think is more common, state unfunded mandates or congressional unfunded mandates?
I guess.
Hey, Jason, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh,
go ahead.
sorry. I was just gonna say, in my experience, it's been state unfunded mandates.
I agree. And there's someone else there?
Jason, I was going to ask if you had any examples, because to be honest, they tell me to check a box. I check a box. I don't really know what's unfunded or not. And if you have anything you could reference.
There was you know what? There's Prop 1, for example, that's going to be on the ballot this year. And it requires it basically what it really is more funding for mental health. But unfortunately, with that, while the idea is good, and the will is there, unfortunately, the money's just not there. The deficit aside, we're gonna borrow more from the state to if this initiative is adopted and made law this November, it would take effect January 1 of 2025. So like things like that. California, we're very unique in that not only does our legislature create mandates, but we have the ability to put mandates or any potential law on the ballot, so we can circumvent the legislature and just do it ourselves if we get the proper the amount of signatures, which is really a low threshold. It's only 7% of the amount of people that voted in the last gubernatorial election, so that's really not a whole lot of people. I can put anything on the ballot with potentially 100,000, 500,000 signatures. That's not that does require some work, but it's very possible. And it was just a couple of years ago, there was 12 initiatives on the ballot. That's quite a bit. And where the state legislature and where these ballots get you is they often sound really nice and they sound like they're going to solve the problem, but in reality, the money's just not there. There was an idea, and John, this may be you don't work for a sheriff's department, but anyways, there's an idea floating through the legislature that would require the sheriff's deputies who are in charge of the jail or are manning the jail to determine whether or not someone has a mental health issue or a drug issue. And if that's the case, then we need to direct them to the proper authorities at hand to make sure they get the help they need. Well, that sounds great, but that really falls on the sheriff's department. And and let's say the 58 counties in California, let's say 20 of those sheriff's departments are already in a massive deficit. Well, they can't afford to have their guys who are really there for one particular purpose, which is to keep peace in the jail, all of a sudden being counselors and trying to figure out whether or not someone has a drug or mental health issue. So things like that have the best of intentions really come down the pike a lot in California.
Well, I will say, Jason, that we pretty much do that already on the street. Maybe not so much in the jail, because typically the deputies that work in the jail are, fresh out of the academy. They're doing their 2 years before they go out to patrol. But I mean, every call I go on, there's that question of, hey, is this person 5150? Is this kid 5585? Or do we go the criminal route? You know what I mean? So obviously having that patrol experience dealing with mental health issues and drug use and recognizing the signs and symptoms. I mean, I do that with everybody I contact. You know what I mean? It's just the deputies might not have that experience, but that's like a 40-hour class and you could have them trained up to do that. But we also have a form we take when we take someone to county where we check a box that says, hey, this person needs mental health assistance. So they also see a nurse, a screener when we walk them in, where they ask them a whole bunch of medical questions and check all these boxes so that they also get the services they need. So I would argue we're already doing that, but yeah.
The caveat to this bill, and where it's really controversial, is that it would also require these folks to be institutionalized against their will. That's really the big hang up on it as well.
I'm okay with that.
Well, I'm sure we all are, but we just can't do it legally in California yet. So yeah, to moving on is John, you're right. We do put a lot on our first responders that I don't think they shouldn't be doing. Wasn't their initial focus, but I digress. Yes, there's a lot more. We're a very active state. What's the old saying? So goes California, so goes the nation. We do have the habit of wanting to be first, and wanting to lead in everything. Um, and with that being said, we have a lot of unfunded mandates that come through the legislature and through the ballot process as well, quite frequently. With Congress, they do the same. They have a broad range of factors. They address key issues, and relative to influence of federalism as a value in comparison with the influence of their other policy goals on congressional decision making. Voting on mandates is largely dependent of the congressional contribution to be more deeply held national policy goals. Federalism typically lately has lacked institutional support in Congress as value driving decisions, according to Posner. The chapter, the third chapter, anyways, in the reading, examined the congressional roll call votes on mandate issues between 1983 through 1990. And that was just quite frankly interesting. There has been, while we still do it, there are a lot of unfunded mandates that have become burdens to the American people. To continue with the rush towards consensus, significant and costly mandates passed over the 80s and 90s, for the most part, did not prompt divisive roll call votes, and thus they were not included in the analysis that he provided. Mandates with the greatest cost impacts on state and local governments were most often passed unanimously in both committees and on floor voting in both houses. There was conflict in those discussions, but it was resolved in the congressional process, and most mandates became politically unsaleable as they moved through the formal committee and floor consideration. That was something that I found interesting and that you kind of see a lot here. If members don't like a bill, but they publicly won't um, speak out against it or just kill it, they find ways to like gut and amend it or just make it so not tolerable that it just dies on the vine. And I can only imagine on a congressional level, member to member conversations and how they interact with that. Now, unfortunately, I don't know if it's better or worse, but today it seems like things are a lot more out in the open, and there are just a lot more public fights in Congress instead of those private conversations. Posner also spoke about the state and local government interest group type behavior. Um, he spoke of key variables affecting congressional adoption of mandate concessions is the balance of interest groups pressures brought to bear on the legislation. He cited Justice Blackmun's majority decision, recognized by noting that the state and local governments must rely on their own political resources and prowess, not the Constitution, to protect their prerogatives and costs from the federal encroachment. The state and local governments have shown that they have considerable influence, and when they choose to apply their political resources, um, I'd say that's true. Uh, Whenever the state legislature wants to get the federal government's attention, they pass a formal resolution. I don't know what that goes beyond that, but if a body, in our case, we're the fourth largest economy in the world, if that state legislative body has something to say, I think typically Congress will listen. Posner continued with the politics of consensus, and he mentions that in 1986 Congress passed a major new regulatory program requiring the nation's school districts to clean up asbestos in their schools. He cited the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act have projected costs for local schools ranging from just over $1 billion to $3 billion. Making this legislation among the most expensive and intergovernmental mandates to be enacted in the 80s, especially. Asbestos manufacturers were also concerned about the legislation. That legislation could support schools and parents seeking to recover asbestos removal and related medical costs. That's one of those well-intentioned ideas, but there's no assistance. The cost is there, and that's where we all don't want asbestos in schools or in any buildings, but what Congress has this noble idea where we clear it all out in the 80s, and but these school districts, some who may be strapped with for cash or some who may be flushed with it, are stuck with the bill. And where does that money come from? And one of my biggest issues working in the state government, especially, is that we have all these regulations and unfunded mandates for businesses or nonprofits or local governments, but we never ever help them pay for it. We just say, okay, do it. And by the way, if you're in the state of California, you need to get it done within 2 or 3 years. And then once you achieve that goal, more often than not in California, we move the goalpost. So you're still behind, even though you achieved what we asked you to do years prior. He cited, not he cited, but there was another one, the American with Disabilities Act, that was signed by George H.W. Bush in the 90s. The ADA, making buildings ADA compliant, another unfunded mandate. It was well intentioned, but it put a lot of strain on businesses that all of a sudden had to renovate their properties and government buildings as well, their properties, to make them ADA compliant. He started to discuss, Mr. Posner did, the mandate reform amid much intergovernmental fanfare. Congress had passed the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act in 1995. It was the first plank of the contract with America to pass Congress and to be signed by the president. It marked accumulation of concerted efforts by state and local governments and their allies within Congress to stem the increasing reliance on mandates by federal policymakers. Does anyone believe that helped in the way of easing up on unfunded mandates? The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act?
Weren't there a lot of unfunded mandates though that continued even after that act was passed?
Yes. It was held, so they called it like a symbol of substance and renewed congressional commitment. But again, it's one of those things that sound good, but did it actually get anything done? Um, I can see where they're even working in government where people get incredibly frustrated because, you know, we could argue have things got better, have things really gotten have they changed for the worse? Because now what's put in front of us is something that sounds nice but has no teeth. Um, but does anyone else want to chime in on if they think that the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act has helped the nation?
Sounds like it didn't, Jason.
Thank you, John. So attentive. He also listed the burdens and issues with unfunded mandates, which are, you know, again, are regulations or requirements imposed by higher levels of government that don't provide the necessary funding to implement them. That's essentially, again, what an unfunded mandate is, and he goes on about the financial burden. There's no assistance that lead to, for local municipalities, often lead to budget shortfalls. It's an additional strain on resources. The strain may affect essential services and programs as funds are diverted to meet new mandate requirements because they continue to come. The reduced flexibility, the potential service cuts, the inequitable impact. Unfunded mandates often affect different jurisdictions and organizations. California often has a one-size-fits-all approach to governing, and California, we all know, is very diverse. It's made up of large cities, medium cities, big cities, uh, uh, or I'm sorry, small cities, and not all of us are equipped. Um, the other issue is that there's resistance and noncompliance, and that many believe that it undermines local decision making. Of course, there's the usual unintended consequences. It stifles innovation, and there are often unpredictable costs. But to Dr. Powell's point about the 0.8 legal alcohol driving limit, you know, there's the positives of unfunded mandates is that you there's a standardization of practices. It addresses externalities. You achieve national objectives. You ensure minimum standards. In theory, you avoid a race to the bottom sort of idea. Unfunded mandates can prevent this by establishing baseline and that all entities must meet, which again may help, may not. Sometimes you're allowed to spread costs over time with unfunded mandates. You allegedly, in theory, again, create a level playing field. So I think that he was pretty even and fair. Dr. Posner was. I think that there's a negative view of unfunded mandates. I would argue that based on those folks that answered my questions, that they probably think the same thing. Does anyone have any positive experiences with unfunded mandates? That'll be my last question this evening.
Unfortunately not, Jason.
I do not either.
That's a no for me.
And I tend to agree. I appreciate everyone's attentiveness. I know things can get a little dry every now and then, but yeah, I appreciate it, and I think that's my presentation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jason. Very well done. And it's one of the things I really like about Paul Poser's article is that it really does a nice job of combining together our topic for this week, mandates, with our topic for last week, fiscal federalism, in terms of looking at unfunded mandates, and then our topic a couple of weeks ago with the political aspects, because he's really looking very much at the political explanations for why we have these unfunded mandates coming out of the federal government. And I really like the point that Jason made about initiatives. I think that's a really important point, that oftentimes we talk about these mandates coming out of the national government or coming out of the state legislature. But as Jason correctly points out, here in California, we have pretty low bar for initiatives to make it onto the ballot. And so through that aspect of direct democracy, we're allowing people to vote directly on these initiatives, and these initiatives can carry with them some very costly implications. And so these could actually end up being unfunded mandates that are being passed directly from the voters as opposed to coming from a legislative body. I think it's a really important point that we oftentimes don't look at when we talk about unfunded mandates. And so kudos to you for pointing that out. I think that's a really great observation. I think that yeah, Posner does take a very dim view. I mean, at the very end of the article, he kind of refers to this process of these unfunded mandates as kind of being the inclusive authority model of federalism. You remember back when we talked about the Deal Right article, we said, Deal Right presented us with three different models of federalism, provided us with, the coordinate authority model, the overlapping authority model, and the inclusive authority model. And in that inclusive authority model, the state and local spheres of influence are completely subsumed within the national sphere of influence. And so that's very much the centralization approach to federalism. And Posner really believes that that's kind of where we ended up with all these unfunded mandates. I do think it's interesting that he gives us some political explanations for why we have unfunded mandates, kind of in a similar way to which Philip Moneypenny last week provided us with political explanations for why we ended up with grants, and especially categorical grants. Posner would agree with Moneypenny that at least at the time of the writing of this article, as he says, I'll find the quote, it's in here, a couple pages from here, where he says, the change in congressional incentives was perhaps most important. Most studies suggest members of Congress freed from their state and local party moorings became anxious entrepreneurs in search of new policy ideas and profiles to gain media attention and political support. They basically make the argument that as more of these members of Congress became kind of free agents, where they were not really beholden to their political parties, because many of them were independently wealthy, they launched their own campaign without having to work their way up through the party apparatus. And as these free agents, they basically needed to score political points. And one of the quickest way you can score political points is with sponsoring legislation in Congress. And oftentimes that legislation ends up resulting in unfunded mandates or partially funded mandates on state and local governments. And so I think that's one of the political reasons. As Jason correctly mentioned, oftentimes when these mandates these mandates come about, they come about kind of in what we call the issue attention cycle, or the punctuated equilibrium approach to policy, in which there is this great euphoria over the idea of addressing this issue and solving this problem. And so these mandates come out of that euphoria where you have such strong public opinion behind these mandates, it becomes very difficult for state and local officials to oppose the mandates. And they're very politically popular, which means that it's almost impossible to stop the mandate. So instead, what state and local governments did is they started trying to affect the way in which the mandates were being implemented, to try and get a seat at the table in terms of how to implement the mandates. That, according to Posner, actually created a problem for these state and local governments. And as he says on page 269, ironically, the very success state and local governments enjoy in modifying mandates helped legitimize the federal regulatory presence itself. Basically, by having success at negotiating and bargaining over how these mandates would be implemented, just the very participation of state and local governments in that bargaining process made the mandates legitimate and made it kind of institutionalize those mandates and made it even more difficult for state and local governments to fight against these politically popular mandates. Now, it is important to note, like with all of the articles, or the vast majority of the articles we talked about in this class, this article was written it's from 1998, and so it's a few years old now. And I think some of the assumptions that Paul makes in the article may not be quite as true today as they were back then. The one assumption I think is not quite as true today is where he makes the argument that elected officials have been freed from their party moorings and they're more able to to kind of buck the party and do what they want to do, even if the party is not supporting them. I think that was certainly true in the 1990s. I don't know if it's as true today in 2024. We've mentioned this before. We've really seen a galvanizing of party discipline on both political ends of the political spectrum. And we see more party line voting going on among Republicans and Democrats in Congress than perhaps we may have seen back in the late 1990s when Posner was making his argument. And so I think we always have to kind of update these articles and say, well, what has changed and how has the political landscape changed? Again, it's a really great article to really pull together the past 3 weeks of the class and allow us to see some of the political reasons why we end up having these unfunded and or partially funded mandates. Okay, thank you again, Jason. Very well done. Let's move on to our third article, since we've already talked a little bit about bargaining and negotiations, and that's another look at bargaining, and that one belongs to Yesenia. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Jason's such a great speaker. I think it's going to be really hard to like follow that. So I will try my best, but great presentation. Go ahead and share my screen. Just want to make sure everybody can see my my screen.
Yes, we can.
So the article that I took was another look at bargaining and negotiation in intergovernmental management. The authors were Robert Agrandolf and Michael McGuire. The authors discuss the historical basis of our current system of intergovernmental bargaining, and they outline the need of our current system to exist. Our old system was highly transactional. In the US, it's currently designed for a system that's described in the article, the type of intergovernmental relations and this relationship that extends beyond grants and aid programs. The authors describe 4 pillars of bargaining and negotiations. And we will go into detail of each of these pillars later on in the presentation, but I just kind of wanted to put them out there first. It's the importance of territory or place, tradition of a limited national bureaucracy, long-standing practice of stimulus action across levels of government, and consequent reciprocal, interactive, and administrative action. Just for a really quick icebreaker, just in general, can somebody chime in on what would be the function of a pillar, like in a building or just in general? Can somebody kind of chime in on that?
Holds things up.
Exactly. Thank you so much. All right. So yeah, it provides a support for another larger structure. It builds the foundation. It builds the foundation. So by understanding these 4 pillars, we will be able to establish our understanding and bargaining and negotiation and in federalism. So the first pillar is a jurisdiction-based management. So the importance of place of jurisdiction-based management. There's a strong American tradition of local differences. Administrative conjunction is the jurisdiction lines are increasing porous and lines are less critical than the past. So before you could distinguishably tell the difference between each municipality. Each jurisdiction has different laws and interests, municipal codes, processes, policies that we follow. However, some observers suggest that the definition and the meaning of place and territory are actually changing and are becoming less and less important for administrative affairs. Just super quick, I just kind of wanted to touch on this next question. How many jurisdictions do you think you are involved in throughout your life? So I'll kind of go ahead and start just to set the example. For example, I live in Pomona. I work in El Monte, both LA County. I do a lot of my shopping in the San Bernardino County. My children play ball in Riverside County. We go to school our school is based out of Long Beach, and we go to Orange County for the beach. So I kind of go to many different jurisdictions. Can anybody else kind of put in their 2 cents on how many jurisdictions you probably visited this weekend? Or today? Not a lot of people live, play, and work in the same jurisdiction. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that, that we do have many interests in many different jurisdictions. So again, does anybody want to kind of chime in on where did you visit Monday on Martin Luther King?
Yes,
Sure.
Cynthia, I was gonna say that in terms of jurisdictions, I stayed in Orange County, but I was talking to people in Texas today and business, impacting regarding business like that was impacting them, and in other states. So like on any given day, probably multiple jurisdictions. It's interesting to think about. I wasn't ever thinking about it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so it kind of just basically goes back to our statement made by the authors that jurisdiction lines are very porous, and we're kind of not just staying in our city, our county, like we're venturing out and we're having interactions with different jurisdictions. So the limited national bureaucracy. The second pillar they go into in bargaining and negotiation is limited national bureaucracy. The U.S. government is structured, was designed out. The U.S. government structure was actually designed out for potential state abuse. So it actually diminished when state administrators' growth was needed to administer federally funded programs. To ensure that local control program is prioritized, intergovernmental corporations actually essential as well. So the article kind of provided one example of a federally administered program that is not locally centralized. Does anybody want to take a guess on what federally administered program is locally centralized? I'll give you a hint. Monday was a holiday, so we didn't receive our mail on Monday.
The U.S. Postal Service.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So that's the example that they use. Thank you for chiming in. So to follow up on that, do you think that your local post office should be locally centralized or kind of keep it federally administered?
I think it's good to keep it federally administered so that there's like one responsible body, and it's I feel like if the mail is localized, that's one way to like politicize something that is a national utility.
No, that's actually a great example. I didn't think about that. That's really good. Anybody else have an idea or want to put in your 2 cents on why it should be centralized or keep it federally administered?
I was gonna say I actually disagree, simply because we've had issues where, we're sending out city mail, but it somehow gets routed to a different county, and we don't know how that happens, right? And so it takes longer for somebody to get their mail, even though you're sending it within the city. So having it centralized might help with that issue.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Because yeah, if I send out a letter to like my brother in Texas, if locally centralized, how long would it be would it take to get to Texas? So that's a really good point. Anybody else have anything else to add? Okay, which takes us to our next pillar is multi-level stimulus action. So basically means the need for more than one system of government to operate at any given time. The US is multi-layered and interdependent. So my question here is actually more of a scenario question. And so anybody can kind of just chime in. So say you work for a local police department and you were assigned to a drug task force to help capture major national and international drug distributors. You are working out of downtown LA. How many different levels of government do you think you'll be working with in your task force?
Well, I think it's kind of a trick question, because typically these task forces, if it's a federal task force, then all these cases are being presented federally, and the TFOs, the task force officers, come from the different departments. And it depends, is this a task force that is put together by LAPD, LA sheriffs, or are we talking about, like an Orange County TFO task force that's playing around in downtown LA? Because I've done that before too, and it's we didn't deal with anybody else. It was just us, and we're doing our thing, chasing traffickers.
Oh, good points that you brought up and good thinking. So say it's a um federally run one. So say it'll be your agency, I would consider LAPD, Placentia PD, the state of California, the FBI, the DEA, the federal courts. So that's just an example of this multi-level action. So I think it actually helps to take an issue or a policy or a policy and make it more efficient and effective. Which leads us to our last pillar, which is reciprocal administrative action. Administrators will take on a big role here. So to a considerable degree, local success in advancing the interests of local government depends on local officials taking advantage of what the federal government has to offer and is willing to take advantage in a step. The opportunities is universal, but not every local administration partakes. So it's up to the department, to the administrative discretion. There are 5 essential reciprocal roles of local governments when it comes to, in regards with working with local citizens and groups. They acquire of external aid to local needs, adapter of external government functions in service to local conditions, experimenter with new functions and services, initiator of government programs that spreads across states and nations. Underlying the others, provide a means by which the local community can pay the ant necessary to sit in the game. That is to secure an effective voice in government decision of local impact. It is a voice as a function of administrative and federalism that brings on the reciprocal action. Examples of this would be grant programs. Local jurisdiction must bargain with the state or federal, whoever they're receiving the grant for. The agency who is receiving the grant needs the state or federal government for the fundings, and the state or federal government needs the receiving agency to implement change and policies. So that would be what the reciprocal action takes place. I do have another question. I kind of want to take it back to this week's discussion topic. Can anybody share a grant that you were involved with? And do you think you had any room for bargaining and negotiation in that grant? Because I believe there was a couple of people who actually administered the grants. So anybody have anything to share or want to put in their 2 cents on this? So I'll go ahead to the next topic, which is
Yesenia, I can share from the grants making side of things, not necessarily in the context of public administration, but just, as a grant maker. In terms of negotiating, it's always a little difficult. I mean, there's room to make concessions for certain things, but when it comes to requirements and the contracts and whatnot, there really isn't room to budge unless that's mutually beneficial. And in that sense, there's a lot of negotiating that goes on at different levels of the grants process in order to get to a place where everyone feels comfortable. But in that sense, it really does go back to that give and take, and tit for tat, or however you want to put it. If we're going to give you this, we need something in return. As crass as it may sound, and I don't think that would be any difficult or any more different at the government level, in the sense that it does need to benefit whoever. You cannot implement a grant or provide a grant at the sake of what the grant is intended to do. So certain concessions can be made, just depends on what is being asked.
Thank you. That's very informative. I really don't have that much experience with grants, so thank you for sharing. It's really informative. Thanks. So next will be bargaining and negotiation actually do go beyond grants. So intergovernmental bargaining and negotiations go beyond grants. It can be less visible and more routine. So examples of these are on the PowerPoint. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. It changed the distribution of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act funds from a broad-based distribution program to a performance-based standard program. In fact, it is backed up by penalties in order to achieve testing, accountability, and transferability levels. The ACA, the exchange program, it's another example. So it's establishing of the state exchange. The federal government gave a deadline to the states that had to establish an exchange. Some states didn't do it. They were kind of like, whatever, we're not going to do it. So these states actually didn't participate. The states that didn't participate, the federal government actually set the exchange rate for them. So that right there, they lost all their ability to negotiate by not setting the deadline, by setting the exchange rate on the deadline. Another example is Garfield Heights, Ohio. So this city, they tend to submit more than the limit of 2 local project applications per year for a grant. The city was told to reduce the number of applications to the normal, I believe it's just 2 or so. So normally they would submit like 6. So they were told, hey, kind of go back down to submit 2. So Garfield Heights came back and they said, okay, well, we'll reduce the number of proposals that we submit. However, can you guarantee that at least one of the 2 will be accepted? And it actually was. So that's another example of them kind of bargaining and negotiating, where it's kind of like, yeah, like just guarantee us 1 and we're good. We'll submit 2 a year, great, and everybody wins. Another example is Atacha, Michigan. They allowed the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to do some experimental water testing at the agency that the agency had requested. After the testing, the EPA in Chicago wrote to the city officials a letter informing them that the testing was completed, that they will hear from the results in some months. Oh, and by the way, the agency there might be a charge for fee for the testing. So the city came back and they responded with, we reserve the rights to charge the EPA for the water run through the testing sources as metered by the Public Utilities Department. So as a result, the city received the test results. However, after that, there was no further communication or contact for the EPA. So that's another example of the negotiations, obviously beyond the grants. So this question kind of leads to our discussion question for next week. do you have an example of intergovernmental bargaining over federal policy, or do you have any first-hand experience of bargaining between local jurisdictions? So kind of what would an example of like the No Child Left Behind Act, the ACA, the Garfield Hiles. Do you guys have any examples or first-hand experience of these bargaining techniques that either you guys used or seen on the news or know of somebody that went through that process?
I got an example. When I was a school resource officer, they negotiated with the school district to basically up the percentage that they contribute for the officers' pay, total compensation, medical benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to say they ended up settling on about 75%. So part of the justification was during the summer, the officers not work in the schools anymore, but obviously they still have the knowledge and they could still respond to different things. So, but the school district didn't want to pay for it, obviously. So they settled with 75%, which obviously can pay for almost fully pay for another officer in the department. So that's, I think, one example.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool because then, the presence of the officers at the school, you just have that community involvement now. So it works out really good as well. Anybody else have any more examples? Just gotta keep in mind it's gonna kind of help you with your discussion for this week. Um, so the article ends up with there is still bargaining negotiation is inherent in the US federal government. However, there's still more research that needs to be understood in the role of impact of bargaining and negotiation. So basically there is lacking research. The research is lacking here. There is a large body of previously unexamined research that proves that intergovernmental bargaining is the foundation, of federalism. But again, the research is still lacking. So this is my last question. So based on the readings and your personal experience, do you think there should be bargaining in intergovernmental management? And again, going back to the SRO, like I think yeah, just because you know the city got that funding for which could pay for the extra cop, the relationships between the city, the law enforcement, and the district is going to grow too. Um, Anybody else want to add anything to this? So
Sorry, I was.
oh, sorry.
And I was gonna say that I think bargaining is important because it allows for space to be collaborative and maybe see things from another person or another agency's point of view that you might not have thought about that, as you said, could improve the relationship.
Thank you. And I sorry about that. I can't see like any icons, so I don't know if people are raising their hands or not. So I do apologize. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Um, so this article is pretty dense. I kind of probably read it a few times before I kind of was like, oh, okay, I see the connection little by little. But I think the big takeaway is to understand the four pillars of the bargaining and negotiation and how that establishes the foundation for our understanding of federalism in the future to come. So thanks again for participating and thank you for your time. And I'll take it back to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Yesenia. Very well done. And you're right, it is a relatively dense article and has a lot of different points to it. I think you did a really nice job of covering all those salient points. It's an interesting question in terms of how do we study bargaining. I think, as the authors talk about, we know from kind of a general sense that bargaining negotiations, they are important in intergovernmental relations. Obviously in our system of American federalism, we're dealing with relationship between sovereign entities. Now, entities are going to be relatively more or less sovereign, depending upon the issue or the policy at hand. But in our system of American federalism, you have sovereign entities. That is very different than a unitary government. You think about a government like Saudi Arabia, which is a very unitary government, has regional district governments, but all those regional governments are all part and parcel of the crown, all part and parcel of the royal family. And so you don't have the same sovereignty among subnational governments there as you do here. So whenever you have that type of sovereignty, bargaining is going to become important. I think one of the interesting arguments that the authors make is that, as Yesenia said, they argue we need to have this renewed research agenda focusing on how bargaining happens in intergovernmental relations. The problem, though, as they point out, is that we really don't have an existing database that we can make conclusions from, that we can draw generalizations from. We have this general idea of these anecdotal examples of how bargaining occurred, like as Yesenia pointed out, Garfield Heights, Ohio, with their grant applications, Ithaca, Michigan, with saying, well, if you're going to charge us for the test, we're going to charge you for the water that you're using in that test. And those are really interesting and kind of funny anecdotal examples, but we don't really have a database of all these different ways in which national, state, and local governments bargain with each other. And I think it's inherently difficult for us to put that type of database together, because whenever you're looking at bargaining, it is a very idiosyncratic type of concept, and that's going to depend upon the levels of government that are involved. It's going to depend upon the types of governments that are involved. Are we talking about a general purpose government bargaining with a special purpose government? It's going to depend upon the issue and the policy that's involved, the actual actors who are involved in that bargaining. Some people naturally are more predisposed to engage in negotiations, while some other people are less predisposed to engage in negotiations. And so I think there are so many nuances to the way in which bargaining occurs. It's going to be inherently difficult for us to create a database of all these examples of bargaining and then use that database to then draw those generalizations. I think one of the primary utility of the article is that it refocuses our attention on the idea that since you have so much overlapping authority going on in our system of federalism, since one policy or one issue may affect a multitude of governments, we have to recognize that bargaining does occur. In the policy class, you probably talked about people like Pressman and Waldowski and their study of policy implementation, and how Pressman and Waldowski told us about all these instances of bargaining that go on in policy implementation. And basically, the more bargaining that you have, the less successful your implementation tends to be. So we really do have to understand how bargaining operates and how to be more effective in the way in which participants are bargaining in policy implementation. But what it does is when we focus more on bargaining, we have to understand that it's a much more qualitative study than perhaps a quantitative study. In federalism, we love our quantitative studies. So we love to look at how the amount of grant money has increased or decreased from one year to the next. What type of government is getting more in terms of grant reimbursements than another type of government? That quantitative information really appeals to us as social scientists and political scientists. But I think when we're studying bargaining, we're not going to be able to be that quantitative. It's going to be a much more qualitative type of an endeavor. And it's really going to require that we reorient the way in which we think about the data we're collecting and how we go about collecting that data. But I think it is an important point that we have to recognize that everything is not just carved in stone. And just because a mandate comes out of the national government or the state government doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way in which it's going to be implemented. There's a lot of negotiation and bargaining that goes into the implementation of that law or that mandate. So thank you again, Yesenia. Very well done. Again, I think it's a really interesting argument to try and get us to rethink the way in which we study federalism and to recognize the importance of bargaining and negotiations. Okay, we are now at 7:30, so I think this is the perfect time for us to take our evening break. If it's okay with everyone, if we can take about a 10-minute break tonight instead of 15, just a 10-minute break. Come on back at 7:40, and then we'll move into a discussion of our final 3 administrative articles for the evening. But come on back at 7:40 and we will finish up. Okay, we are back from break. Hopefully those who have left will be coming back in very soon, but we'll move into our 4th article for the evening. So it's American Public Administration, the Impacts of International Governance. And that one is Michael. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you. Good job to everybody that presented before me. I covered this topic. I read it multiple times just to kind of understand what exactly was the author trying to, you know, deliver. And, I did struggle because I don't have much of experience with, politics or any governance. But the topic covers public administrations and the impacts of international governments. And the way that I translate it is, how effectively can the U.S. administration function internationally? A more vivid description that the author uses is, how would the U.S. handle threats from terrorism that are engaged by U.S. agencies at the national level, at the subnational level? Which problems are negotiated at home versus abroad? The topic also covers health authorities, and an example of that we witnessed during the pandemic, and it also involves international financial systems. The topic covers global governance. Global governance covers social, health, security, and finances, just to name a few. Multiple forms of transnational cooperations have emerged that limit national autonomy, as mentioned in the book. Regimes, organizations established to address collective policy problems. So my first question regarding the global governance is there a specific hierarchy model that would be utilized or could be implemented to successfully tackle international conflicts?
Say that one more time, Michael.
So the question is there any specific hierarchy model that would be utilized or could be implemented to successfully tackle international conflicts? I mean, I'll give an example that I researched was NATO. So what specific hierarchy could be utilized, if any?
I mean, I would have no idea about anything about this, but I would imagine that whatever international country has the conflict, I mean, they would have the final say over everything, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to kind of, think about it. And the way that I saw it was how, during the attacks of 9/11 on American soil, how America responded. However, it's not as simple as just going over and, bombing who you think is doing it without any intel. And also, there's alliances that you must take into consideration. So what I came across of NATO is a Secretary General is a senior political figure of a NATO member from a country that's joined NATO, is appointed by the member states to a 4-year term. This selection is carried through informal diplomatic consultations among the member countries, which put forward candidates for the post. The decision is confirmed until the consensus is reached on one candidate, and at the end of their term, the incumbent might be offered to stay. So just as you mentioned, Travis, yeah, you would think that, depending on who attacked who, it'd be a more direct. However, since it's a global issue, and alliances are formed, the United States or other countries have to be careful of just, declaring war based on those alliances. So there has to be some kind of hierarchy, just like there is a hierarchy in the government in the United States in regards to global governance. Um, so the growing institutionalization consists of initiatives that are designed to facilitate the management of policy changes beyond the control of any single state. International organizations have been recognized for decades as constituent parts of governance. And as I mentioned, there's international agreements. There's like the non-controversial agencies that are ran globally would be such examples as Universal Postal Union, International Communications Union, the World Meteorological Organization. But then we get into deeper ties like the United Nations, the World Bank's International Monetary Fund, the UN, educational, scientific, and cultural organizations. So that goes into tying to the globalizing governance. Okay. So another question that I have, that it's my second question, is how would responsibilities be divided within the nations, and who would control the resources contributed to any given alliance?
That's a good question, Michael, but I think the power of control for a particular resource would fall on who provides it, just because it, I guess, sort of serves as their leverage. So if, one country has the weapons that another one needs, ultimately they have a say in how those are used.
That's the great perspective. That's something that I struggle with as well, just, because the United States has always been the powerhouse. But, there's been articles and there's been conversations and discussions about how America can lose that title to China because of the impact that China is having on the economy. So the responsibilities would, like you believe, go to the provider, the one that's providing the most. So that's an important topic to keep in mind of, what's going to happen in the years to come. Hopefully it's not within our in our lifespan, but it's really an important thing to think about regarding those responsibilities. So an American variant on an American slice is this next section is, covering environmental changes. One of the big topics that have been utilized in the past, decades is climate change, global warming, as it's formerly known. And it's not the responsibility of just one given nation. It is the responsibility of international forces. It is not sufficient to emphasize on U.S. public management to be excluded on international factors. An important thing to highlight is, the United States in the 1990s decline entering the Kyoto Protocol. They rejected it in the U.S. in the late 1990s due to the lack of cooperation. Though there was kind of some punitive actions towards the United States because of the lack of a cooperation. The United States did not feel like the Kyoto Protocol was going in the right direction, so they declined to enter that protocol. And in response to that, when the United States got attacked during the September 11th attacks, many of those European counterparts refused to join against the anti-terrorist agenda. So it's important to understand that, those alliances that the United States fails to form can come back and, and bite them, because now when it came time to deploy against the global terror, a lot of these European counterparts, refused. And it was all because of the decisions that the United States failed to enter from the Kyoto Protocol. So implications for American administrations: thousands of administrators exchange informations with their counterparts and other countries and are involved in negotiations. International commitments embrace objectives and carry implications that must be dealt with domestically. Internationalization also shapes making and budgeting and finance. Connections can be quite direct, such as international agreements, and committing countries to lowering tariffs and other trade barriers. So one of the last questions that I have would be, how would international governments be measured, and how would the nations that fail to meet objectives be held accountable?
Well, it seems like that would be part of the negotiation process, right? Before these countries or agencies decide to collaborate on such a large scale. I think these objectives and standards should be set. And I remember that was one of the things we talked about in our last class. So how will you measure? Well, that's something that you have to talk about.
Exactly. It's a tough, it's tough to measure anything, especially like, when you have a broad topic as far as like, climate change. How do you measure the success of climate change, given any nation that's doing their part? And, the United States is a bigger nation compared to, say a nation in Europe that is doing their part in trying to combat the same objective. But for other nations that fail to meet objectives, or just fail to just wanting to be part of the alliance, like I mentioned, they can impose sanctions and tariffs to the countries that are not willing to cooperate, if that is something that the alliance is deems it necessary for international success, or intranational success, as it mentions in the book. So the globalized future of public administration is already emerging, and extend far beyond international terrorism and national security. The context is not a worldwide government, and the U.S. content is not an increasingly irrelevant public administration. Developments are on their way into a more firmly institutionalized polycentric system based largely on a multitude of functional, specific international regimes. Like I mentioned, this topic where it's pretty difficult to understand, given my lack of experience in government. But it did pop. It created more of an idea of how we're not aware of how these alliances are formed, and unless we're affected by it, nobody really dives into how these international alliances are formed, and how the public administration in the United States is affected, because if they form these agencies to prevent global climate change, the United States has a responsibility to you know to somehow minimize their carbon footprints, and vice versa, other countries have their responsibilities to also do that as well. So it does affect the way that the administration in the United States addresses these future issues. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Well done. And one of the excuse me, one of the connections between this article and the one that we just read, the bargaining article, is the bargaining article introduced more complexity and essentially said that if we're going to focus on bargaining, it's going to be a more complex, more nuanced, more difficult way of studying federalism and public administration. Likewise, in this article, if we're going to start looking at the impact of international treaties, international agreements, that excuse me, also going to then add a lot of complexity to the way in which we understand public administration and intergovernmental relations. And I think that when we have the overlay of these international agreements and these international treaties, it's another level of rules and regulations that state and local governments are being held accountable for. And one of the problems is when you have these agreements being established at the international level, oftentimes we overlook the nuances and the specific differences between states like California versus Texas. What California wants, what California feels like it needs, will probably be something completely different than what Texas wants and what Texas feels it needs. However, does Texas have a seat at the negotiating table when we're talking about an international agreement and an international treaty? And for the most part, the answer to that is no. So sometimes we gloss over some of the differences between state governments whenever both these state governments are being held equally accountable and responsible for these international treaties and these international agreements. So I think it takes it beyond the national level. Sorry, excuse me. It takes it beyond the national level and really does increase it up to that international level and adds another dimension and another layer to how we study and how we understand intergovernmental relations. And it's really that globalization that we have seen really take off over the past few decades. And I think we're going to continue to see that accelerate. We're going to see more international agreements. We're going to see more international treaties. And so globalization will probably have even more of a pronounced impact upon state and local governments. And as we had mentioned before in this class, one of the problems we run into is whenever we have these treaties that are agreed to by one administration, and then 4 years later, we have a new administration with a completely different approach ideologically. Oftentimes, the new administration wants to withdraw the United States from the pre-existing agreement. We saw that when the Trump administration came in and attempted to remove the United States from some international agreements that were promulgated by the Obama administration. Now we've seen the Biden administration, the attempt to try and put the United States back into those agreements that the United States was pulled out of in the Trump administration. But again, for our purposes, it's just kind of, again, adds another level of complexity to how we study and how we understand intergovernmental relations and state and local governments. Yeah, I apologize for my voice. I'm still dealing with this. It's been about a week and a half now, so it should be going away at any time, but I apologize for my voice a little bit. Okay, well, thank you again, Michael. We'll move on to our next article, and that's the Homeland Security article by Don Kettle, and that one belongs to Travis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so as Dr. Powell just mentioned, I did my presentation on the Homeland Security, the Federalism Challenge by Donald F. Kettle. So before I even read, I mean, I know it's a little self-explanatory, but I looked at different sources of what Homeland Security really is and what the scope is. So just to remind everyone, the goal of Homeland Security is to secure the nation from all threats, both foreign and domestic. Their primary mission is to improve and reinforce national security. The scope of Homeland Security includes customs, borders, immigration, natural and man-made disasters, i.e. act of God, terrorism, and cybersecurity, among other things. Homeland Security, which I just learned this not too long ago, but Homeland Security was passed by Congress after 9/11. I did not know that we did not have a Homeland Security department prior. And this was in response to unify the nation after the 9/11 attack. Literally a couple months after 9/11, Homeland Security began operation. So I know it's kind of a simple question, but real quick, does anybody have a general idea of what Homeland Security really is, to being either like a local, state, or federal entity?
Let's say it's a federal.
Okay. Anybody else? So what is Homeland Security to you?
It's the agency that allows me to use a global citizen when I travel.
There we go. Yeah, so I mean, everyone's correct. Another quick question I had is, upon just stating what the scope of Homeland Security is, being the customs, borders, immigration, natural man-made disasters, terrorism, cybersecurity, does anybody have an idea of what the current issues that face our Homeland Security are today could be? So like, what are we currently facing as a homeland security threat, or maybe previously.
I mean, I want to say it's something that's in the past and it's still present is our border security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the main topics in my article critique. So, I mean, whether you agree or disagree with immigration, we can't deny that there is some issues that come with immigration, whether that be illegal guns or criminals, drugs, etc., or maybe foreign people that could, uh, allude to America's downfall. We don't know, but that definitely is a current issue of homeland security. So in the article, according to Kettle, there is a huge mass confusion and disagreement about what homeland security is, which is why I asked that question. So most local officials, according to Kettle, will say that they only know how to respond to a homeland security issue, and that they merely just need funding to be able to respond to certain situations when they do arise. So that could be COVID-19, for example. They if COVID-19 didn't happen, they would have said prior to that, hey, we just need funding, so we can respond to an issue. However, if you ask people from the top of the ladder or the top of government, they will say we need a response system in place that incorporates preventative measures. So on one side, you're saying they just need money to be able to handle a situation. On
Between
the other
60 and
side, you're
80
saying,
is 50.
oh, was that to me? I don't know what just happened. But on the other side, people are saying we need a response system that incorporates preventative measures, so stopping homeland security threats before they actually take place. So Kettle believes one of the core reasons as to why people have disagreements about homeland security is due to who should be in charge of it and how it should work. So that will lead me to my next question. Who should be in charge of homeland security issues and how should it operate? So should it be a federal, state, or local government issue, or collaborative? And how should homeland security operate?
I would say it has to be collaborative. I know we have fusion centers. I know we have one in LA County as well as Orange County, Okayak. And they have obviously federal personnel and kind of like with the drug conversation earlier, they have task force officers that specialize in various, whether it's cybercrime or you name it, they have TFOs from the county that basically work at the fusion center. But yeah, I mean, the feds don't have enough personnel, and they obviously a lot of their information's fed by the locals. So I would say collaborative for sure.
Yeah. Anybody else have a thought on that?
I agree on collaboration. But I recently watched a documentary about John Gotti, and I did my article critique on the Homeland Security was, the United States failed to capture John Gotti on many of his on his crimes that could prevented some murders, but it was a lack of communication between the agencies. The FBI has had certain evidence that they failed to give to the CIA and to the local police department. So, the collaborative method would be the ideal in a perfect world where everybody can collaborate to, secure, homeland security. But the more agencies that you have, the more disconnect, the more miscommunication can happen.
Exactly. You're kind of getting into what Kettle starts getting into, but yes, I agree. So Kettle goes on in one of the sections about questions the division and the sharing of power between the national and state governments regarding homeland security. So one of his quotes was, all homeland security problems begin initially as an issue of first response by first responders, end quote. Therefore, Kettle argues that most homeland security problems are local governmental in nature, which is so true, which I never thought of before. When a threat usually happens, it usually is in a specific local government. Granted, COVID-19 was an anomaly. Homeland security issues are inherently intergovernmental and not necessarily a lone federal issue. Because Homeland Security is deemed a federal issue, at its core, it is believed by Kettle that local state governments are going to be limited in the discussion of their own security. So, like I said earlier, I mean, I know the basis, or previously I knew the basis of what Homeland Security was. However, I didn't realize there was such a complex interworkings within, and that local governments did not have much say in their own security, and it was a lone federal issue at its core. So one of my next questions is, does our current homeland security system incorporate a federalist ideology slash approach, or is one more controlling over another? So I know we just talked about should it be collaborative or individual, but in our current state, is Homeland Security more leaning one way rather than another? So, I mean, to answer my own question, so I think previously, I think the federal government was more controlling over the state and local governments, but I think as I'll get into in a little bit, today I think we've adopted more of a intergovernmental relationship between the three levels of government. So home and homeland security should involve the people directly affected with an issue. Federalism refers to the division and sharing of power between the national, local, state governments. So one of my next questions is, are state and local governments capable of deterring homeland threats or responding disasters today? So again, are state and local governments capable of deterring homeland threats or responding to disasters without federal government intervention?
I don't believe they are.
Why?
Well, I think that 20 plus years have passed, so the government, I think state governments in that regard have gotten maybe relaxed. But it was always the federal government's job to handle those types of attacks anyways, or services. It was never on the states or local municipalities to handle a
Mhm.
terrorist attack.
Does anybody disagree with that? So for the most part, I do agree with that. Um, but you could argue that a lot of counties, states, and local governments are getting more funding to be able to deter threats, and you can definitely see that the first response system or systems today are a little stronger. I think for the most part, you are correct in terms of deterring. I don't see Orange County or Los Angeles County being able to deter a threat on its own without federal intervention, but it is a interesting question. So another question I have is, do you know of any current measures or policies within your government workplaces that involve plans of action if an attack on Homeland Security did happen? So do you know of any policies right now in your workplace of plans of action if something were to occur? I would
That's
hope, being in HR, most people do say yes. No.
I
uh,
was gonna say we do not, and it's pretty scary.
What
I would say
about after God?
we have Well, I guess it's like an exit plan, right? In the event of like an earthquake, not so much a terrorist attack.
Mhm.
We have an evacuation plan and we practice it every like 6 months just to make sure everybody knows which exit to take and where to meet and how to do the accounting, what to do if somebody isn't, or you don't find somebody, things of that nature, but they're sort of general and broad, and thankfully we haven't had to implement them.
Yeah, I mean that's where, which I agree. That's where it kind of gets hard is because we do have a response to these things in our workplaces, such as maybe open fire situation or a fire hazard or a gunman, earthquake, so on and so forth. However, you can't necessarily prevent these things. You can have security at the front to maybe stop people with metal detectors. Can't stop an earthquake, can't necessarily stop a fire. It's usually a response system in place. So I'm taking longer than I thought I would, but I'll try to skip a little bit. So for first responders to be effective upon the arrival at a scene, it must involve a strong public health system. According to Kettle, the biggest weakness at the local level is public health in terms of homeland security issues. It should be noted that most states have not incorporated public health in their first response system. The main issue with the first response system is the valuable minutes that could be wasted because particular groups are not being called upon in which they are actually needed. So for the sake of time, I won't ask the question, but um, Kettle noted that when he did write this article many years ago, uh, when when there was a sickness happening in school systems, they didn't necessarily know who to call, or they did know who to call, but um, the health officials weren't called to the scene with included as the first responders, which obviously caused a lot of issues. And I guess the biggest part of this entire article from him was the lack of coordination and communication amongst or within the Homeland Security strategy. And one of the things that he mentioned that could be beneficial is possibly being more mutual aid agreements, meaning the sharing of resources between counties. So I guess today, do you guys know of any examples or know of any counties that have entered a mutual aid agreement, i.e. sharing of resources?
I know the fire departments typically have them because they'll send out a truck to fight fires all over the state. I think they probably have quite a few agreements because they get paid from when they leave the fire station to when they get back. So that's where all those firefighters make their money. But
Yeah.
that's what comes to mind right now.
Yeah, the biggest example I have in regards to this would be I live in Orange County, which is pretty close to Signal Hill, which is a small little jurisdiction, which is weirdly completely engulfed by Long Beach. So that is a prime example of a mutual aid agreement because Signal Hill doesn't have their own like fire department or police force. They've entered a mutual aid agreement to where Long Beach jurisdiction would send their first response into Signal Hill if need be. Um, let's see. And so, I mean, those are some critiques that he had again. Oh, do they have their own PDOs, fire department then? Um, so again, the biggest critiques of Kettle in terms of our the previous Homeland Security before present day was communication, coordination, lack of not having a proper response system in place to handle Homeland Security crisis, not being on the same page of who should be in charge of Homeland Security, how much funding should be allocated to states. Will the states properly use the funding to give to counties to be able to deter threats? Can counties deter threats, or can they just respond? So on and so forth. So those are the main arguments. Kind of running out of time here. But one of the solutions that I never would have thought of, and I actually thought was a pretty good idea, was creating like a minimum floor protection plan, which in a nutshell, that just means that certain counties will be able to choose a tier system of protection that they think they would need. Maybe that could be like bronze, silver, gold, etc. Each level has carries a certain amount of protection, or deterrence, or response, um, if need be. So I guess my last question would be, would a Homeland Security funding tier system be appropriate and beneficial, and how would this be funded?
That's a good question, and I think a lot of agencies would probably want to pay, maybe, I guess if you're near the border, you would want to pay more. But
Mhm.
for other agencies, you probably would be sort of at the bronze level until something happens in your city, then you're gonna wish that you were paying more into this fund.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think to finance it is every city should be contributing based on the tier that they're in.
Mhm.
Not sure how that calculation would come about.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I like it. So one of the things I mentioned in my paper as I was kind of researching this is, again, the biggest threats today are immigration. So a lot of those southern states, I would imagine they would want to pay for a more premium tier system of protection, two to tier better, whatever that may look like, and in response to certain things. Maybe Los Angeles County and San Francisco would want a more premium floor protection plan because there is a drug war going on. Maybe high populous states would want a high floor protection plan in case there was an act of God situation or a COVID pandemic, or maybe there's statistically more public shootings or mass shootings in these areas, and they want to be more prepared and there's more risk associated. So it's an interesting thought. Uh, in a nutshell, closing remarks, Homeland Security is primarily a coordination problem. Coordination is a problem with intergovernmental relations and federalism. And according to Kettle, federalism isn't likely to respond appropriately. That ends my presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Travis. And that that last point that you ended on, I think, is the really important takeaway from Kettle's article, is that these problems with communication and coordination, they're endemic to our system of American federalism. So they're not necessarily created when there is a terrorist attack or when there is some type of a natural disaster, but rather those terrorist attacks, those natural disasters, they shine a spotlight on those communication and those coordination issues. And so that's where we become very cognizant of those problems, is when those types of events occur. And then there's a scramble to try and figure out, what do we do about it and how do we fix it for the next disaster, or for the next terrorist attack. And so I think it's just is kind of part and parcel of our system of American federalism, is we're going to have those communication and coordination types of issues. We're all familiar with the stories on 9/11, where the NYPD and the NYFD were operating on different frequencies, and it made it difficult for them to communicate. And the NYPD had helicopters in the air getting an overall view of the situation from outside of the buildings, but they weren't able to communicate that information to the firefighters who were inside the building because of that lack of communication capability. I think that's just one example of those communication issues that we see really get highlighted in the in a natural disaster. I also think that it's important to note the centralizing impact that September 11th really had on Homeland Security and our approach to Homeland Security. As a result of September 11th, as Travis talked about, the creation of this Department of Homeland Security, the creation of the TSA that we all are very familiar with and know and maybe not love all the time at our airports. A couple of years after that, we had the creation of the Bush administration of the Real ID Act. Now, 20 years later, we're still trying to fully implement. And California is one of those states that has not fully implemented the Real ID provisions, and we keep getting extensions. I think our most recent extension, if I'm not correct, takes us through 2025 before we're required to have those Real ID elements in the California identification card or driver's license. But it was a very centralizing approach, where our answer to problems with Homeland Security and these types of events was an answer coming from the national level. And I think that's really the normal response that we typically have, because the resources, the capacity to respond to these types of things, that capacity, those resources are usually greater at the national level. However, the first responders, when we are dealing with these types of situations, those will come from the local level. And so we're trying to bridge that gap. How do we get the resources from the national level into the hands of these first responders at the local level? Because it's really going to be those local first responders who are going to be the first ones on the scene. I think that, again, the big takeaway from this article is that all those communication and coordination problems we see in disasters, those are not necessarily caused by the disasters. They're pre-existing in our system of American federalism. They just have a spotlight shined upon them whenever we have these types of natural disasters and these types of events. And I'll stop there. My voice is working again, but I'll stop there. So thank you very much, Travis, for taking us through Don Kettle's article. And our last article for the evening is the Walters article, Intergovernmental Relations and Federalism. It's past, present, and future. And my favorite question, does anybody actually care? And that one belongs to Jesse. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. Yes, as the professor has stated, my topic will be the intergovernmental relations and federalism. It's past, present, and future. And does anyone care? I also thought that was pretty funny when I first saw the title, and after reading the article, I began to understand why he put that in there. It's on page 384 in case you haven't read it, or if you would like to read it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So when it comes to intergovernmental relations in the United States, it describes the interaction between federal, state, and local governments in the American political system. Understanding these relationships is vital for someone working domestic public affairs, especially at the local level. Each level of government in the federalist system is responsible for certain functions and powers. The study of intergovernmental relations has historically been a haphazard and inconsistent endeavor, with no single entity dedicated to gathering people, collecting and analyzing data, or conducting policy work related to intergovernmental affairs. This is surprising, as almost every policy area in the United States has intergovernmental consequences that require action or response. There are dozens of major policy areas with direct intergovernmental connections and consequences where the federal government sets policies and states and local governments are primarily responsible for delivering the results. Despite this, there is no single collective coherent effort to investigate how local, state, and federal governments interact on an ongoing basis. So for the first question, when you think of what was just stated, what are some themes that have been impacted by governmental relations? So for example, education, maybe the COVID pandemic response. When you think of that, what other themes have been impacted by governmental relations?
We got social services, tax administration, environmental. I think you might have mentioned that already. Environmental issues, energy, election reform, transportation, business regulation, and I think definitely more on the state level, like law enforcement related changes as well.
Definitely. No, thank you for that. Yeah, definitely quite a bit of fields that are impacted by governmental relations. And kind of feeding off that, um, how has a lack of intergovernmental relations impacted you at your workplace? So think about where you work. Is there, due to the lack of intergovernmental relations, impacted, or due to the lack of intergovernmental relations, has it impacted you at your workplace?
So I
Go ahead.
I also wrote about this. This is my article critique as well. And one thing that I thought was, um, I think if there were intergovernmental relations experts involved in the process, I think they would have probably prevented this. But I always think of Proposition 47, and I know I've brought it up a few times in other classes, but um, by basically decriminalizing drugs and raising the dollar amount on theft crimes, I think and I believe a intergovernmental relations expert would have foreseen this, but I believe it created what became the homeless crisis and also what is becoming this retail organized retail theft crime spree that's going on around the state, causing businesses to shut down. But I think if there were experts and offices dedicated to this process, they would have done the math, done the calculations, and kind of seen this coming and could have made better recommendations for changes instead. So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Thank you for that answer, John. Yeah, no, definitely, I definitely agree with you on that. I think when I was thinking about this question, one thing that came to mind for myself was COVID. When we shut down, it had a negative impact on businesses. Some no longer remain open. Definitely ended a lot of careers, and all this was kind of implemented by the federal government, which then was passed on to the states, and then obviously local. For example, I live in the borderline of Los Angeles and Orange County. So the restaurant down my street, I could not go inside. I was, grab and go versus if I drive 5 minutes away, I could eat inside and enjoy a meal. But regarding back to the question where I said impacted your workplace, the questions started coming around. If you're not vaccinated, you could lose your job. So I know when this was the first set of vaccines came out, a lot of us were still kind of hesitant, and we're like, "Are we going to lose our jobs if we don't get it?" So there was definitely, I believe, if there was more intergovernmental relations, it would have been more streamlined. Although, yes, COVID was definitely something new for all of us. Um, Let me go ahead and continue. Now we spoke on the themes, workplace. How about if there's how has the lack of intergovernmental relations impacted your daily life? So whether it's hobbies, something you do on a regular basis, something that impacts you, anyone? No worries. Let me go ahead
I
and
got one, Jesse.
okay.
So for example, I wanted to bring this up in one of the other presentations, but um, it was regarding the like minimum standards for whatever the case is. What comes to mind, came to mind for me was, there's a minimum requirement for states regarding the purchase of firearms, ammunition, and as you guys know, California is very progressive, and they have implemented all sorts of laws to prevent you from purchasing these things, delay you from purchasing these things, increase the cost, and also restricting what you can and can't buy. Um, I think this is one of those things where, and obviously they're in a lot of heavy, lawsuits right now for this. Just most recently, they imposed a concealed carry weapon permit law where, citizens, non-law enforcement, basically who had their CCW permit could not carry on sidewalks and, very kind of obscure locations, basically preventing you from carrying anywhere. Thankfully, this got shut down, but again, I think if there was experts in place that their sole job was to analyze the effectiveness of these laws, I think they would have prevented a lot of it and also saved the state a lot of tax dollars to fight these battles in court. So that's something that's, obviously a hobby of mine, but also part of my job. And just if they just stuck to the minimum standards, I think there'd be a lot less drama and I think, believe it or not, even less crime as well.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that response. I'm going to go ahead and continue on. So, intergovernmental affairs is often overlooked as a distinct discipline due to its deeply ingrained role in American governance. Policy questions such as tax reform, healthcare, and regulatory reform often go unanalyzed from an intergovernmental standpoint, leaving the task to a small army of scattered scholars and journalists. These analysts often done after the facts. So, rather during the policy debate and development, usually it's after the fact. The lack of focus on intergovernmental consequences is also seen at the state level, where local government often feels ignored when it comes to governors and state legislators shaping state level policies and programs. Um, there is little conversation in states about the intergovernmental consequences of programs and fiscal decisions between states and local governments, which leads me to my next question. Does anyone have an opinion if things would be different if there had been intergovernmental relationships involved in the decision-making process? For example, if intergovernmental relation experts were involved in handling COVID, new policy, various legal matters. Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I guess one thing that comes to mind, Jesse, is RENA numbers. And RENA is Regional Housing Needs Assessment, for those that are unfamiliar with it. And one of the things that some agencies are sort of fighting against is anybody that overproduced in one cycle, those numbers don't get added to the next one. And so it's sort of, if you were allocated 6,000 units to produce and you produced 7,000, those extra 1,000 stay part of the old cycle and don't get fronted to the new one. But with housing sort of becoming more and more difficult to build out, agencies do want that to be considered. So I think if an intergovernmental sort of specialist had been involved in that decision-making process, we maybe wouldn't be having those conversations today.
Great example. Thank you, Fath. Anyone else? All right, then let me go ahead and power on. So, the lack of consistent attention to intergovernmental consequences of policy decisions is most powerfully manifested at the federal level, as seen in um, the recent read of the battle of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The fight was over whether the new employees of such a department would be covered by federal civil service rules. Um, the intergovernmental conversation argued that this lack of debate has widespread consequences for states and local governments. The Government Accountability Office, also known as GAO, reports that current federal revenues do not cover expenditures, and if current trends continue unchanged, the federal government would only be able to cover half of its fiscal commitments by 2050, which is pretty mind blowing. State and local government advocates predict that the trickle down effects of the pending fiscal crunch could be severe, with Medicaid and Medicare being two of the largest potential targets, potentially shifting significant costs onto states and local government. Um, if that were the case, and if we were to cut Medicaid to keep the government funded, the question I have would be, how does everyone feel about that? I mean, the lights would possibly stay on, but many people would suffer. Any thoughts on that?
I'm no Medicaid expert, but I would imagine all of us would be on it at some point when we're, and especially in 2025, as you say, 2050, I think you said.
Yeah.
We would all probably be suffering if that was the case. So yeah, it's pretty disheartening. Government should do a better job of funding all of its programs so that everyone that's paid into it doesn't get screwed over in the long run.
Definitely. I mean, when I was reading this, I think one thing that came to mind was Social Security. How they have mentioned, I think by the time we hit that age, it will no longer exist. So yeah, just something to think about. One thing that um I apologize. One thing that Walters was speaking on in this article, he shed light on there was the Advisory Commission of Intergovernmental Relations, also known as ACIR. Um, it was something in regards to intergovernmental relations. They were pretty much a group that came together to study and I guess try to hold intergovernmental relationships accountable. Um, Kind of makes me think, that's something that we kind of need today. If we were to bring back that group or start a new group in regards to that, um, who should be in charge? Should there be a agency that takes over? Should it be people that are voted on? I mean, I think one thing to consider is we definitely want experts in intergovernmental relations. So would it be scholars, stakeholders of policymakers, people who would be impacted, members of Congress? What are everyone's thoughts on that?
I think definitely experts, like some of the authors that wrote this book probably be a good start. People that can analyze the data, crunch the numbers, and basically tell the future. If we change this policy, what is the trickle down effect, for this, that, and the other, for the state, for the local, for the citizen. Obviously, the people that are trying to implement the policy should be in the conversation to sell what they're trying to sell. But at the end of the day, I think if we could take politics out of it and just go straight with the data, the facts, and see, if this or that is going to be worthwhile or not have any negative impacts. And I think at the end of the day, I think everyone means well. They want to change things for the better, but they're not actually looking down the road to see how it's gonna impact everybody.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I would definitely love to see no politics mainly involved due to the division that we currently have, where I believe it's pretty much at an all-time high. One thing I was thinking of is for those who work in local government, anytime a city gets a new council member that maybe has no direct influence or regarding coming from some sort of organization or works for some sort of government entity, you kind of have that hope like, all right, someone's a true resident and they're going to come and make some positive changes That's kind of what I was thinking when I was thinking of this. Someone that has no affiliation, but they're also, you know, this is their field. So some sort of mixture of that would be amazing. Um, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say that was my last question. So if anyone has anything else to say. All right. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to turn back to Dr. Powell.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jesse. Well done. It's the article really can be somewhat depressing because it really does point out, as Jesse talked about, the fact that we no longer have this ACIR, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. And the ACIR had been around since 1959. It was in existence from 1959 until 1996. So it had almost 40 years of history whereby it would study these issues of intergovernmental relations. And the way in which the ACIR would work is that it was funded by Congress, but it would then contract with investigators, with academics across the country to put together different projects and do different types of research in intergovernmental relations types of issues. And I worked on one of their projects just before it was defunded. I hope it wasn't my fault they were defunded, but just before they were defunded in 1995, I worked on one of their projects where I was looking at the impacts of the Americans with Disabilities Act on local school districts and to see what types of fiscal impacts there were and then what the opportunity costs were in terms of how much these projects cost and then what those monies were then not being spent on. And one of the things I found, just kind of as a side, is that a lot of local school districts were not aware that they could incorporate these ADA capital projects within their capital improvement plan. There is this misunderstanding, if you will, where local school districts thought they had to implement all these projects all at once in the very beginning of the implementation of the act, but they were allowed to incorporate them over a 5-year capital improvement plan. But that was just my little piece of the pie. And then there are other researchers who are looking at the impact of other federal laws on other types of governments. I think there are maybe 25 or 30 contracts that ACIR had given out. And the problem for ACIR is that they, based on all this data and all these findings they got from all the researchers, they then put together a draft report. And the draft report called for taking a lot of these federal programs and turning them over to state governments and allowing state governments more authority over these programs. And of all the programs that the scholars looked at, there are only 2 programs that were recommended to remain federal. All the other programs were recommended to be turned over to state governments. The problem with that draft report is it never was approved by the commissioners on the ACIR, but it had been leaked. And so members of Congress got a hold of this draft report before it was ever actually adopted. Obviously, Congress did not like these findings because they didn't want to turn these policies and these programs over to state governments. And so they did what we call zeroing out. When you zero an agency out, you take its money away. And so in fiscal year 1996, Congress zeroed out the ACIR, took its money away, and so the ACIR could no longer pay for office space or to pay for any of these contracts. And so the ACIR essentially went out of business. Since the ACIR went out of business in 1996, we have not had another successor organization created to look at these types of intergovernmental relations issues. And now we're looking at 28 years since it was abolished. And once we lost the ACIR, we lost that centralizing force in examining these intergovernmental relations issues. So we no longer have that central organization to organize this type of research. And so, as Walter says, it's now left up to what he called the 1,000 flowers across the country. All these individual researchers and all these individual institutions that are all looking at these intergovernmental relations issues, but there's really no overarching agency to pull all this work together and to make sense of all this work that is being done. One of the most concerning things I think that we get from the Walters article is, again, as Jesse said, that question, does anyone care? The problem is that since it's been 28 years since the ACAR went out of business, a lot of people look at it as, well, if we've gone 28 years without it, do we really need another new organization? You know, the world has not ground to a halt. Everything is still operating. So just how vital is it to have one of those types of organizations? So the longer we go without an ACAR, the less likely it is that people will feel that we actually need a new ACIR. And so I think the upshot of all this is that since we don't have that centralized organization to study these issues of intergovernmental relations, combined with what we've already talked about tonight, that the study of intergovernmental relations has become much more complex. As we said with the bargaining article, it's become much more complex because of all the bargaining negotiations that go on that need to be studied. As we talked about with the American Public Administration article with Michael, the idea that internationalization and globalization has added another level of complexity onto the study of intergovernmental relations. So at the very time where the study of intergovernmental relations has become much more complex and difficult, we also have a lack of resources and a lack of organizations to do that type of research. So I think it's kind of that double whammy, that combination of those two factors that makes it difficult for us to really study these intergovernmental types of issues. A lot of authors will refer to intergovernmental politics as being bloodless. That when you think about intergovernmental relations and intergovernmental politics, people usually don't focus on that. Instead, they focus on the policy component. So they focus on, housing policy, or they focus on, criminal justice policy. They're focusing on the substantive policy, but they really don't look at the intergovernmental politics that underpin those policy outcomes. And since intergovernmental politics is such a bloodless and difficult to see and study phenomena, it makes it very difficult for us to have any unified, uniform type of study of the field. So at the very point in time where studying intergovernmental relations has become more difficult, we have fewer resources available to us to study it. So therefore, it all falls upon us as students of federalism to be aware of these issues and to incorporate a consideration of intergovernmental relations in the daily decisions that we make as public administrators. So it's kind of my sales pitch to you to, once this class is over next week, to not forget about intergovernmental relations. And as you are making your daily decisions, think about what are the implications of these decisions for different levels of government, and how can these decisions have differential impacts upon different types of local governments, state governments, and the national government. And always keep that focus on intergovernmental relations alive in all the decisions that you make on a daily basis. Okay, thank you again, Jesse, and thank you to all of our discussion leaders for tonight. Again, I think that these articles do a really nice job of kind of pulling together the information we discussed in the political aspects week, the information we discussed in the fiscal aspects week, and then again, the information that we've discussed tonight in terms of the administrative aspects of intergovernmental relations. Next week, we will continue our discussion and we'll move into more of a discussion of some of the current and future issues in intergovernmental relations. And so just as a reminder, the 7 articles that we have discussions for next week, the Entrepreneurial Cities article, that's Allegra's, we will then pick up on that one from a couple of weeks ago. The medical marijuana article, which is Reggie's, the Federalism by Waiver article, which is Rosa's, the Tax Cuts and Job Acts article, which is Marissa's, the Voting Reform article, which is Assail's, the Governors in Control article, which is Adolfo's, and then we'll wrap up the show with Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crisis, and that article belongs to John. Then if time permits, if we're able to get through all those articles next Wednesday, then I will wrap up our show by kind of talking about those State of American Federalism articles that were assigned that no one signed up for, and kind of talk about where we are in terms of intergovernmental relations and what the future looks like in terms of federalism and intergovernmental relations. So that's all on the schedule for next week. Again, we'll see how far we get next Wednesday. If we have some articles remaining, then we'll go ahead and meet on the 27th and finish up those articles. And we'll talk at that time about what time we'll schedule for the 27th, if that meeting is necessary. But if we get through everything on Wednesday, we will not have to meet then on the 27th. If you have not turned in both of your article critiques yet, the ones that are still available, still fair game for you. The 7 that we'll be discussing next week, plus if anyone wants to do those State of American Federalism articles, those are also fair game then for an article critique. Okay. All right. That's all I have for you tonight. Again, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to me. We'll be back at it again next Wednesday for our final week number 6 and wrap everything up and get everything taken care of next week. All right. Thanks,
Professor.
everyone. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Travis.
No, I said thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Uh,
I hope you have a good night and good weekend, and we'll talk again next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, if you're still there, I have a quick question.